Alright, here's how we'll start. Little demonstration of the domino effect. So, one little start. And just like that, everything topples. Cascading effect. I could align these things up any number of ways. And as long as one of these guys tipped, either direction, it would have cascaded all the way around. And so we have the same principle with numbers. And the point of the exercise is to demonstrate that numbers, just like these little gates and blocks, which I set up to mimic dominoes, hence the domino effect. Numbers are ways we use to express increments and amounts of things, distances, and we have increments that subdivide larger things into smaller parts. You could say we make fractions that way, or we build up relationships. Samples like in geometry, you can represent a progression of numbers as a sum, as we indicated. But the idea is that any system of numbers are symbols. Remembering numbers are just symbols. Any system of symbols that describes your environment in the orders of magnitude is limited. For our system of what we call 10 symbols, it's decimal, deci. I guess that's Roman or Greek for 10. And those are the numbers 0 through 9, or 1 through 9, total of 9 symbols. And what happens is, with our little reduction game, we called it, when you put two numbers together to come up with a single digit, well, we get 11s and 9s. That's kind of interesting. And then the number 10 is right between those two, of course. And what is 10? It represents 5 and 5, the unity of two identical things, to bring you to this new order of magnitude. For instance, if it were timekeeping, we'd go from seconds, and we'd get to that 0 point, and we'd be at a minute. And the counter would go any seconds, and we'd get 2 minutes, and then eventually we'd get to 59, and we'd have 0, 0 seconds, 0, 0 minutes, and we have 1 hour. And you could go on, and we increment things, days, weeks, months, years, and there are other systems and other symbols that accomplish it. And many of them are systems. Even to this day, we have liters and milliliters, which actually is another way of squaring a round unit, and we call that a cubic centimeter, but they're the same thing. And people in medicine know this, and engineers who make all their instrumentation and supplies, they use that. And it's been a long time coming, because for a long time we had this system here that in the United States that utilized what we now call Gregorian calendar, but pretty much the standards around the world, with the exception of the long timekeeping systems. So we go back centuries, and everybody has a different number for the year. Chinese have some gigantic number. The Arabic calendar, that's presently most common now, is based on Islam, and that's a shorter number than the one we use, which of course is fascinating because it's synchronized to the Mayan calendar, and so we had the big 2012 scare and everything else, and who knows what all this possibly means. But the point I'm making is that, and I'll have to do this right now and show you, that we have a 1 and a bunch of 9s. There's an example of that right there. And let's say we wanted to reduce as much as we could. Well, obviously, since we already know that any number of 9s, when added or multiplied together, are reduced to another 9. So we could just scratch all these 9s, leave us with 1. The combination of 1 and 9, of course, would just be 0. Because we have no units now. In the units column, and we've incremented to the next magnitude. So there are lots of systems that might utilize something like that. Like I said, timekeeping. There are many theoretical models where you take a lot of equations, throw them together, and you want to make them all equal 0 because that will be the solution to like I said, a theoretical problem which has a realizable goal. It could be any number of parameters, if you will, or variables that have to be accounted for if you're, looking to build a structure that has enough strength to withstand forces. And so you build it so that forces above, cancel out against forces integrated into the structure so that you don't have weaknesses like wobbling and tipping over, so you can design against everything that Mother Nature throws at us. And there are a few structures that really can satisfy everything. But you look around the world, and of course we know that they've been built, and usually they're built out of stone, like pyramids, for example. They don't just go away, ever, without some help. Now, I wanted to explain how this idea of cascading numbers for the purposes of just working with numbers, or in practical application, it's pretty easy to see that when you're using the symbols that you've grown up with and become accustomed to. But there are many others that have been in use for a lot longer than the systems we're accustomed to. And it's very possible that there could be any number of systems that have been employed and are being employed today. For example, as I was explaining earlier about the bee. Let me show you. Here, let me just adjust that for a moment. Set this right in place. Hopefully you can see. There they go. What the scriptures I was referring to. And you'll notice that the B, as I explained earlier, it seemed to have some binary implications. And what is binary? Well, that's just where you have the digit 1 and 0. And the magnitude expressed by a 1 followed by a number of zeros is in powers of 2. For instance, we use powers of 10. There's a digits column, then the next increment is powers of 10. And the next increment would be powers of 100 and 1,000, and so on and so on and so on. Well, powers of 2 seems like it would take a lot of ones and zeros to express a number, but you'd be amazed how large numbers can get when you're just doubling them. And another system that is probably, and I'm going to take a flying leap and say it's definitely even integrated into the actual logic of multiprocessors. And if you know anything about the history of computers, it is mind-boggling when you consider that once upon a time, before there were monitors for everyone to interact with the computer, that particular function was the exclusive domain of systems analysts and managers who oversaw, usually in the large systems, teams of individuals who did nothing more than punch cards, and other teams who were responsible for seeing that that information was fed in the proper order to a device that would convert those punch cards into a tape, and that tape would be read into a disk, and that disk, or many disks, would then be loaded into a computer and massive amounts of data we moved around using number combinations that have to do with conversions of numbers. So in between our decimal system and this binary system is another system. We use it today. It's called octal. And what's the thing about octal? Well, in the world of octal, you compare that with what we call digital. They used to say that, well, our number system evolved because we have, one hand, 5 digits, another hand, 5 digits, and there's our 10. So, based on that line of reasoning, perhaps once upon a time there were critters that had, thinking critters now that could use numbers, 4 digits on each hand. So the most they'd ever come up with is what we call 8. Who knows what that number would be called? And here's something else while we're at it. Anyway, before we do that, so imagine, now we have a series of numbers, 1s and all 7s. Guess what happens when we see that? Now we're octal-based thinking persons. And so all those 7s reduce down to a 7. And, of course, they're complementary. And we get to another magnitude, followed by 1s. This is octal. Same thing with binary. For instance, 1 is 1, an octal, binary, and digital. This number is 2 in binary. And there's 3. And there's 7. Because 2 and 3 make 7. And so there's 1, there's 2, we double that 2, and it's 4. So 4 and 2 and 1 is 7. You'll notice that. In digital, or binary rather, that's it. That's the maximum. For instance, you'll notice when that 2 and that 3 got added together, that 1 didn't see anything. It just dropped right down. But this one and this one require that we go to another magnitude. I'll show you something else that's really interesting. Well, it's already there. It's just like this means 2. An order of power, second order of power, or in the first order rather, because 2 to the first power is 10, or rather 2. If that were octal, then that 1 would represent what we call 8. And what we call 11, which a computer would recognize as a number 3, is in octal the number 9. 10, or rather 8, what we call 8, and 1. Isn't that fascinating? So we can see a symbol, and it can represent many more things than we would even begin to believe. So let's go back to that interesting relationship we learned about 153, which brought us to eventually work out these little scriptural indices here that led us to the Book of Kings, because they actually mentioned Solomon and said Solomon was never arrayed, and being humans we're going to do what you say not to do, and that's understood. And then we did this reduction thing, remember, which came 9 and 11. And believe it or not, you can add the 6 and the 12 and the 29 and the 27 in both directions, as I showed you before. And in doing that, in this particular case, we did come up with, the number 11 when we cross-checked them. Anybody does accounting and other types of recaps to, for business purposes as a general rule, they understand that's called cross-checking, and that's very elementary. But what are you doing with that? Well, you're taking all these different elements and you're adding them both ways, because you may have sub-details within these particular, say, parts of your accounting network. And no matter how you put them together, they're going to satisfy an equation. And the one way has to come back to the other way, equal one number, and that's cross-checking. But it was rather interesting that these numbers did reduce to this 11. Right, what we did. And we demonstrated right here, and this is the New Testament, if we recall, that there are properties, and we call them generally properties of association. Because no matter how you list these numbers in any grouping, in any order. You can subgroup them and add them together. As long as you only use them once, you're always going to get the same result. And that's a law. It's a property of numbers, and they teach that over and over again, and they might call them rules, they might call them theories, laws, but you just know that. You can see that just by doing the operation. You can worry about those details later because there's much more to understand. And also, when we went to those actual books and kind of arrayed just the books themselves to see how things might be working out, it does seem to make sense now that you would kind of notice this cross weave, this pattern that's taking place. And, this math kind of brought out this 9 and 11. And here we found out, of course, that there were some interesting aspects to Kings and Chronicles because each one of them seemed to have this 11 and 9 structure built into them. And it gets even more and more interesting when we start to consider that the number 100, or 153, as we say, seems to have to do with all of this. And then that 153 just happened to be we got this where we can be seeing it. There we go. It happened to correspond to the sum. If we added Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, we get 153. Now you'll notice to the right of that perforation I've got some other numbers. And you'll notice that at the very bottom I've got 231, which on the other side says 153, which is 9 times 17. And 11 times 21 does equal 231. So if you're following this, what you'll notice is that the numbers on the right are base 8, octal. All this time, we're looking at the most interesting verse, this John 21:11, which, it's right there. And then they talk about 153 fish. Now, isn't that interesting? And just notice that 2 times 64 is 128. 3 times 24 is 24, which makes 152, and one more makes 153. Isn't that something? Actually, are possibly referencing 2 number systems. Now this is the Old Testament, rather than New Testament. Also notice that every increment of 9 is what? It looks like a power of 11. Or, it's got a factor, but it's not. That's another number. It just looks like 11 to us, base 10. But actually, in base 8, which doesn't have a number 8 or 9, by the way, looks like that. So 18 would look like what we call 22. And of course, 9 looks like what we call 11. 9 and 11 are related in a lot more ways than we even thought about it, aren't they? And we can keep going. And here's some more examples of what. There's binary. Can you see that? There's binary. There's 8. No 4s. 2 and 1. We call that 11. And decimal. In octal, there's 8 and 3. Look at this. Some ancient stuff. That's Mayan. There's 2 lines going that way. 2 5s plus 1 is 11. And they're interesting for a number of reasons. But we'll go back, talk about them later. Here's Mandarin. That looks just like a plus and a minus sign, but that's 10. This is the interesting thing about Mandarin, is that there's no such thing as Rishi. See, 10 is she, and this is 1. So you don't say Rishi, you just she. It's 11. I think that's what it says. I don't know. But, you look around town, you look at numbers in Chinatown, they look like this. And in order to make this 20, I just used 2 of these things in front of this. That means 2 of these. So positionally, the Chinese number system, this Mandarin one, is using similar as placeholders, but when they get to 100, it's a different symbol. And 1,000 is a different symbol. The top here is interesting because they could be Greek letters, but they're Roman. There is what we call X. We also use it in multiplications. That's interesting. Roman numbers, Chinese numbers, Mayan numbers, and we use them all for something else. And it's even more interesting than that when you start looking at numbers beyond the number 3. We'll get to that. So there you go. There's some examples of what 11 looks like. And you'll notice octal and decimal and binary. Just look at that binary number. It takes 4 digits. And you can see that, fascinating enough, that an octal to the 3rd is 8, and there's 3 to the 1st. You could actually add the octal, when you convert decimal numbers to octal, and then from octal you could go to binary, and vice versa. And I suppose any further discussion of this is beyond the realm of my experience, or ability to even talk about. So we do want to get to another interesting point, though. And I showed you these 11s. And there's a lot more about this 11. But maybe I'm going to move all of this now. And I'm going to make this little journey a little simpler now, because we're going to go into some books. Because we've covered these number systems, and I told you about the number 153, how it's represented in 2 ways, right there. And they knew this when they made the Bible, so that, we are expecting to find some more examples of this in the Old Testament. And we do. We find it in many, many places, and I'm going to get ready to show you why that's important to learn more about numbers and whatnot. And this idea of unity, things being complementary, because that is really what it's all about. But here you'll notice, I did mention the being, let me break this down a little bit better. Here we have verse 1-6, or 16, 66, and of course 3 6s makes 18. Reduce that to 1, and you follow you just do this algorithm with these numbers, and it just happens to coincide with this succession of ones. And that's interesting because, well, there it is. I kind of mentioned a lot about that. Now, this is really interesting, this one, Hud, because this is the 11th chapter of the 11th surah of the Quran. And you'd be just amazed if you looked at what the explanation is for water gush forth from the oven. And, and it also mentions that the waves towered like mountains. And into the story is, this is the story of Noah in the ark, is that it ends up on Mount Judy, and they explicitly say that. So apparently it was there for people to go see. And here again, in the same surah, which just happens to be 11, is 56. And of course, this verse has interesting ramifications there, and it says, "And there is no living creature that God does not hold by its forelock." And when I get into examining some of these ancient symbols and what they could really on their face be simply referring to, it would astound you, because I have a series which I'm really looking at. I'm studying these babies hard. This is about the brain. And there are 2 tapes, 2 discs in each one of these, and each disc has 6 lectures, and they're small, quick, and you learn something extremely fascinating in every one of these little lectures. And this is pretty old already. I keep checking it out because I got to get my own copy. There are some props in here, like the actual very large cross-section model of the brain, and there are references to the things we now are looking at with MRIs and CAT scans. And of course, they've been cutting brains apart and dyeing them and staining them and learning all about the circuitry, and we can pretty much figure out where every activity, every precept that is made is found in the brain. And what's amazing is that when you start studying these holy books and you see what some of these scriptures are pointing at, then you begin to see there is no way that any of this is a coincidence, much less an accident. Just like, and I have to find out more specifically about this, there is no way that this theory of evolution can fly. But, there is logic in that. But when you see an animal like a giraffe, or a bird whose tongue literally wraps around the back of the brain, inside the skull, either way, there's no incremental, viable phenotype that could survive to reproduce, to give you an animal that has like a giraffe, a fully developed organ in the back of the brain to prevent what we would call an aneurysm from blood being rushed up this long canal. And it's got this huge heart for this purpose too, but imagine you get a stroke. And of course giraffes have to go down on their knees and jump back up, and they have to raise their head and lower it. I mean, if we did that, well, we'd just be passing out, dying, hemorrhaging. And they've got this organ fully developed. So I should mention Mr. Lloyd Pye, P-Y-E. You want to really get excited about what we don't know? Look at that guy's videos. I'm not going to even mention anything other than that, but anyway, there's so much more to everything. But we have the means to kind of get past all the mysteries and the subterfuge and see what the real basic nuts and bolts to everything is. So I've got a lot of books to return again, and there was no easy way to do this. I just had to do this little bit right here so we can really start focusing in again on this idea of unity. Because what we're going to find out is that this number plan, which on its face can lead to some interesting aspects of human behavior, well, there are models for it in other than the Quran or the Bible, because there are things that are, to understand it, even older. And guess what? In addition to stories, this math is in there. And so we're going to come back and show you something about this crazy guy Plato, pupil of Socrates, and how it's because of our inability to accept other ways of looking at things, like these variations in numbers. For instance, the 231, that seems to be implied, as I showed you, in John 21:11. Could be that, but it could also mean the same as what we call 153. Maybe that's part of the purpose of that. So stop right here and clean up and do some household duties and get back to this. Okay, thank you.